This is Dr. Lurie again. I'm the author of Psyche Politics, How to Read the Political Mind. It really does present a completely unique perspective on politics. In any case, we've been talking about managing fear. This is a review of a slide that's been up before, so I'll go through it relatively quickly. Basically, stress leads to anxiety, which doesn't feel very good and thus requires coping. There's a range of coping. There's adaptive coping, which leads to growth. There's everyday coping, which I can't call much else besides And the worst is maladaptive coping, which worsens the situation. One example is that of alcohol, which negatively affects the brain, which is how we cope. So instead of coping with anxiety, we're coping less well. Another example is found at the bottom of this slide, and that's the so-called geographic cure, where a person leaves his or her situation in an attempt to cope with anxiety, often worsening the situation by increasing stress. Well, now let's take a little look more deeply at what happens with coping. So just to review once more, there's anxiety, which can be conscious or unconscious, requiring coping. And one of the major ways we cope is by defenses, so-called psychological defense mechanisms. They're often ways of thinking, ways of conceiving, and often ways of behaving that lessen anxiety, because that's what coping is all about. Now, a number of years ago, there was a study begun. It was perhaps in the early 1940s, and the study involved the top 7% of the Harvard class of perhaps 1942. These people were followed over the course of their lives, and perhaps every 5 years, a more detailed examination or questionnaire of them was made. And what was found is that over time, these people separated out into groups of what was found was that over time, there was a range of success they had in life. Now, success was measured not just economically, it was measured in terms of one's social and personal life and one's physical health. The ways of coping were divided into 4. There was a top quartile, and those were the coping mechanisms used by the people who were most successful in life. Here's an example of some of the defenses these successful people used. They anticipated, they rehearsed, they often used humor when stressed or anxious. They used sublimation, which basically means they did what made them feel good, gave them pleasure. And they were altruistic, that is, they shared or gave to others. This was the first quartile as ranked by George Valiant, who put the study together and brought it into modern times. Now let's look at the second and third quartiles. You see, in the first quartile, the successful politicians use these defenses all the time. That's why they're successful politicians. But it's in the second and third quartiles that most people function most of the time, and these are the defenses that politicians will often use in order to win races. That's the second and third quartiles, and here are some of the defenses found by people who are in that second quartile. Those people who are in the middle range of success in life would use rationalization. That's a defense where people find a reason for not worrying. For example, the oil will pay for the war. That was a rationalization of the concern, worry, anxiety people had about the cost of the Iraq war. Denial is another defense that's used. And remember, denial is not denial of facts, it's denial of the implication of the facts. Projection is another defense. Projection occurs when a person cannot tolerate a certain aspect of himself, a feeling, a thought, some aspect of himself. So he projects it, he lays it, he attributes it to someone else. Externalization is very well known in politics. It's often known as blaming, but there are subtleties of it, and we'll cover them later. Displacement is a defense in which people shift the anxiety that belongs in one place to another. It's a little bit like externalization, but it's also a little bit different. Repression is a defense where people render a situation totally unconscious. They don't have to worry about it. Of course, it does affect their lives because it's in their unconscious, but consciously they don't have much anxiety. Reaction formation is a defense that will have lots of attention as we go forward. Reaction formation basically means doing the opposite of what one would expect in one's own self-interest. Finally, there's splitting, which is a third quartile defense, in which people see the world as all good and all bad. Politicians who use lots of splitting are divisive. Those who use less tend to be able to cross the aisle. With this as an introduction, there now will be a series of videos on the various defenses.